The year is 1959, a moment when prestige in space was inseparable from survival on Earth. Every rocket launch, every scientific exhibit, every photograph placed behind glass carried an unspoken second meaning. To the public, the Soviet lunar probe was a symbol of exploration, proof that socialism could conquer the heavens. To intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain, it was something far more consequential, a physical manifestation of intercontinental missile capability. The same engineering that could send metal toward the moon could also deliver a nuclear warhead across an ocean. When the Soviet Union approved an international exhibition tour for its lunar probe, the decision was rooted in confidence. The object on display was not flight-ready, but it was dimensionally accurate, structurally identical, and representative of the launch systems powering Soviet rocketry. Guards were assigned from elite security units. Diplomatic seals were applied. Chain of custody procedures were written with obsessive care. The assumption was simple and absolute. Visibility meant control. As long as the probe remained under watch, it remained secure. American intelligence did not share that assumption. By the late 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency had reached a sober conclusion about Cold War competition. Direct penetration of heavily guarded facilities was rare and risky. Traditional espionage yielded blueprints, not manufacturing reality. What mattered was not what Soviet engineers claimed a system could do, but what a finished object actually revealed once measured, weighed, and examined. Production shortcuts, material choices, and assembly tolerances told a deeper story than any official specification sheet. The lunar probe's overseas transit offered an opportunity that did not depend on stealing secrets from safes or recruiting insiders. It relied instead on logistics. Moving a multi-ton object across foreign cities required local infrastructure: trucks, cranes, warehouses, drivers, and schedules. Each step introduced civilians, contractors, and delays that no security protocol could fully eliminate. This was not a flaw unique to the Soviet system. It was an unavoidable reality of heavy industrial transport. By the time the probe reached Latin America, American planners had already mapped the surrounding environment. Road networks, rail depots, unloading facilities, and storage yards were quietly assessed. Nothing extraordinary was required. No experimental equipment. No exotic technology. Only time, access, and disciplined execution. The plan hinged on a narrow window measured not in days, but in hours, when routine procedures created the illusion of safety. What the Soviet guards believed was a controlled pause in transit would become the most consequential dinner break of the early space race. They remained convinced that the probe was untouched, its secrets sealed behind wood, wax, and authority. They had no reason to think otherwise. By every metric they understood, security had held. They did not yet grasp that the most dangerous threat was not force or betrayal, but familiarity. American planners approached the problem with a mindset shaped by experience rather than bravado. By 1959, the intelligence community had learned that technological mysteries were rarely solved by daring raids or exotic devices. They were solved by process. Every complex system, no matter how well guarded, depended on routines that could be anticipated, nudged, and redirected. The lunar probe's tour schedule was not a secret weapon. It was a logistical burden, one that forced Soviet security to interact with environments they did not control. The probe's transit involved rail yards, temporary storage sites, and transfer points that existed far outside Soviet jurisdiction. Diplomatic protections covered the object itself, but not the infrastructure around it. Local authorities managed traffic. Civilian operators handled cranes. Schedules shifted when equipment arrived late or facilities were unavailable. These were not failures. They were the normal friction of moving heavy machinery through crowded cities, especially in regions where industrial transport followed flexible rules rather than rigid doctrine. American intelligence focused on one principle: environmental dominance. Rather than confronting Soviet guards directly, they sought to shape the conditions in which those guards operated. Contracts for hauling oversized cargo were often awarded locally, not flown in from Moscow. Storage yards were selected for convenience, not security pedigree. Overnight holds were justified as administrative necessities. Each choice appeared mundane, even reasonable, when viewed in isolation. Together, they created a controlled space that looked routine to the Soviets and invisible to anyone not searching for leverage. The planners understood the psychology of security units. Guards trained to prevent theft or sabotage were alert for confrontation, not cooperation. If procedures appeared orderly, if paperwork was stamped and gates were locked, vigilance relaxed. Fatigue mattered. Hunger mattered. Authority mattered most of all. When delays were framed as official decisions rather than suspicious anomalies, resistance faded. No one wanted to argue with a schedule that carried diplomatic approval. Crucially, the operation was designed around time discipline rather than speed. Rushing created mistakes. The goal was to create a calm, unremarkable pause in movement, long enough to allow access but short enough to avoid scrutiny. A single evening, presented as an unavoidable delay, was sufficient. Once the probe rested in a controlled location, the problem shifted from access to execution. The Americans preparing for that night were not commandos. They were engineers, photographers, and specialists accustomed to working under pressure without spectacle. Their tools were commercially available. Their methods were rehearsed. The objective was not theft, but observation. Nothing could be damaged. Nothing could be altered. The probe had to emerge exactly as it arrived, its outward condition reinforcing Soviet confidence rather than undermining it. By the time the Soviet guards stepped away for a meal, convinced that the day's movement was complete, the outcome was already decided. The real operation had been finished long before a single bolt was touched. The controlled location chosen for the overnight hold was not a laboratory or military compound, but an industrial yard designed to handle lumber, steel, and oversized freight. Such facilities were common, poorly documented, and accustomed to irregular hours. To Soviet guards, the site appeared dull and secure, surrounded by walls, secured by gates, and watched by local personnel whose presence seemed reassuring rather than suspicious. There were no flashing lights, no hurried movements, nothing that suggested urgency. That normalcy was the camouflage. Once the guards departed, the character of the yard changed immediately. Vehicles that had blended into ordinary traffic took up positions inside the perimeter. Portable lighting was deployed carefully, shielded to avoid casting visible glare beyond the walls. The team worked under the assumption that every minute lost increased risk, but every careless action multiplied it. Silence mattered. Order mattered more. This was not a race. It was a sequence. The probe itself was housed in a massive wooden crate reinforced with steel bands. Its dimensions alone discouraged impulsive tampering. The Soviets had relied on physical scale as a form of security, assuming that anything so large would require time, noise, and heavy equipment to breach. That assumption was partially correct. The Americans did not attempt to force the crate open from the sides or break diplomatic seals. Doing so would have made discovery inevitable. Instead, they treated the container as a construction problem rather than a barrier. By studying the crate's design in advance, the team identified how its load-bearing planks were fixed into internal crossmembers. Nails could be withdrawn along the grain without splintering if handled correctly. Specialized gripping tools distributed pressure evenly, avoiding visible damage. Each plank was removed in sequence, catalogued, and set aside so it could be returned to its original position. The goal was reversibility. Every action had to be undone before dawn. When access was gained, the interior revealed the true purpose of the mission. This was not about a single component or headline-grabbing photograph. Measurements were taken methodically. Engine dimensions were recorded. Wall thicknesses were checked. Wiring harnesses were photographed in place to document routing, insulation type, and connector density. Alloy samples were taken sparingly, from non-visible surfaces, for later analysis. Nothing was rushed, but nothing was wasted. The team worked from a prioritized list developed months earlier. Items that revealed manufacturing philosophy came first. Material choices, fastener sizes, and assembly tolerances offered insight into industrial capacity and design trade-offs. The probe was not treated as a marvel, but as a product. And like any product, it told the truth to those who knew how to read it. As the night progressed, the risk shifted from access to restoration. Reassembly demanded greater precision than disassembly. Every bolt had to return to its exact orientation. Surface markings had to match. Protective coatings disturbed during inspection were replicated using matched compounds and applied by hand. When the crate was finally resealed, it looked unchanged even to trained eyes. By the time the yard fell quiet again, the lunar probe had yielded its story. It remained physically intact, officially untouched, and strategically exposed. The significance of what had been gathered did not reside in any single photograph or measurement. Its power emerged only when the data was assembled, compared, and analyzed by specialists who understood what industrial artifacts revealed beyond their stated purpose. When the material reached secure analysis facilities, expectations were cautious. The probe had fueled years of anxiety, suggesting a technological lead that threatened strategic balance. Analysts prepared to confront evidence of advanced materials, compact systems, and manufacturing techniques that outpaced Western capabilities. What they found told a different story. The propulsion components were large not because they were powerful, but because they compensated for inefficiency. Engine chambers relied on thick walls rather than refined alloys. Fasteners were oversized, chosen for strength rather than weight savings. Wiring bundles were heavy, insulated generously, and routed with little concern for mass optimization. These were not signs of carelessness. They were signs of a design philosophy shaped by a specific industrial reality, one where reliability was achieved through redundancy and scale rather than precision. Guidance components reinforced this impression. The internal layout suggested systems that worked, but only by accepting size and mass penalties that Western designers had spent the previous decade trying to eliminate. Miniaturization was limited. Components were accessible, replaceable, and built to tolerate rough handling. This made the probe durable, but it also made it slow to assemble, slow to fuel, and difficult to produce in quantity. From a strategic perspective, these characteristics mattered more than any theoretical performance figure. Serial markings deepened the picture. Production identifiers were low, inconsistent, and lacked the uniformity expected from large-scale manufacturing lines. To analysts trained in industrial intelligence, this pointed toward limited output rather than mass deployment. The lunar probe was impressive as a demonstration, but it did not suggest an arsenal waiting behind the curtain. The gap between appearance and capacity began to close. None of these conclusions required speculation. They were grounded in physical evidence, cross-referenced with known Soviet industrial practices and corroborated by separate intelligence streams. The probe had confirmed what aerial reconnaissance and signals intercepts hinted at but could not prove. Soviet rocketry was powerful, but it was constrained by weight, complexity, and production speed. The threat was real, but it was not limitless. For Soviet leadership, the danger lay not in what they had lost, but in what they never realized they had revealed. The probe continued its tour, guards reassured by intact seals and unbroken procedures. Applause followed it from city to city. Meanwhile, its internal reality reshaped strategic calculations thousands of miles away. The most consequential breach of the early space race did not trigger alarms or arrests. It unfolded quietly, leaving no visible trace. And that silence was precisely what made its impact irreversible. The strategic consequences of the operation unfolded gradually, filtered through analysis rooms, briefing folders, and closed-door discussions rather than public declarations. Intelligence derived from the probe did not stand alone. It was integrated with radar tracking data, telemetry intercepts, and production estimates gathered from industrial observation. Together, these sources transformed abstract fears into measurable limits. The image of an unstoppable missile force began to dissolve, replaced by a more constrained and fragile reality. For American decision-makers, this shift altered risk tolerance. Deterrence calculations depend on knowing not only what an adversary can do, but how often and how reliably they can do it. The characteristics revealed by the probe suggested systems that required extensive preparation, visible launch infrastructure, and specialized crews. These were not weapons designed for rapid reaction or sustained alert. They were impressive demonstrations, but vulnerable ones. That distinction mattered in crisis planning. The change in confidence was subtle but profound. Diplomatic posture hardened. Military planners grew less inclined to assume worst-case numbers in every scenario. Investment shifted toward systems that emphasized readiness and survivability rather than spectacle. Solid-fueled missiles, hardened silos, and mobile platforms gained priority, not because they looked dramatic, but because they reduced dependence on fragile processes. The probe had not inspired imitation. It had inspired contrast. Within the Soviet system, the effects were indirect but destabilizing. Leaders sensed that something had changed, even if they could not identify the source. Western responses no longer aligned with the image the Soviets projected. Threats produced less visible anxiety. Negotiations lost asymmetry. This mismatch between expectation and reaction fed internal suspicion. When power relies on perception, indifference is dangerous. The response was pressure. Designers were urged to accelerate development. Schedules tightened. Safety margins narrowed. Programs already straining under technical complexity were pushed harder, not with additional resources, but with demands for results. This environment increased risk. Liquid-fueled rockets were unforgiving machines. Shortcuts carried consequences that could not be hidden behind secrecy or rhetoric. These pressures culminated in a series of rush tests and catastrophic failures that revealed the cost of forcing progress without structural change. While each incident had its own causes, they shared a common origin: the realization that the bluff no longer worked. The probe's quiet exposure had undermined the strategic illusion that protected time and patience. None of this was visible to the guards who had once watched over a wooden crate, convinced they were protecting an untouchable symbol. They returned to duty, filed their reports, and moved on. The object they guarded had already done its work, not as a weapon or a message to the world, but as an unwitting informant. The Cold War often appeared to turn on speeches, summits, and showdowns. In reality, it pivoted on moments when belief met evidence and failed to hold. The legacy of that single night lingered long after the probe completed its tour and disappeared back into controlled facilities. No official acknowledgement was ever made. There were no medals, no public victories, no dramatic revelations. Yet the intelligence extracted during those quiet hours reshaped how power was understood in the nuclear age. It demonstrated that dominance was not measured by size alone, nor by theatrical achievements that dazzled audiences without sustaining force. What had been exposed was not merely a technical limitation, but a systemic one. A system that relied on grandeur struggled with repetition. A system that emphasized spectacle found itself vulnerable to scrutiny. The lunar probe had been built to impress, not to endure inspection. Once its reality was known, it could no longer serve as an unquestioned deterrent. Confidence, once punctured, could not be restored by slogans or secrecy. This realization echoed through subsequent decades of military doctrine. Intelligence agencies placed greater emphasis on physical observation and life cycle analysis. Military planners learned to value production rates and logistical resilience over isolated breakthroughs. The lesson was clear. A weapon that cannot be built, maintained, and deployed consistently is a liability, not an asset. In that sense, the probe's greatest contribution was not to space exploration, but to strategic clarity. For the Soviet Union, the moment passed without recognition. Guards fulfilled their duties as trained. Engineers continued their work under growing pressure. Leaders adjusted their rhetoric, unaware of the precise cause but acutely aware that their leverage was slipping. History would record later crises and confrontations as turning points, but the foundation for those outcomes had already been laid in silence. The Cold War is often remembered through its loudest moments: missiles on parade, speeches at podiums, explosions on distant horizons. But its direction was set just as often by quiet acts of observation and patient analysis. On one ordinary evening, while guards ate dinner and schedules paused, the balance of belief shifted. If you want to understand how unseen details and overlooked routines have shaped global power, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we continue exploring the hidden mechanics behind Cold War history and modern military technology.